Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next guest, our keynote speaker. He is a nationally known speaker, a best-selling author, and president of Amerisearch Incorporated, a publishing company that researches America's noble heritage. His American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America and by the internet. He also sends out a daily American Minute email. His Faith in History television airs on the TCT Network, on stations across America, and via DirecTV. He was a former U.S. congressional candidate and appeared on many TV programs and has been interviewed on thousands of radio programs. He has also been referenced in many newspapers and magazines. His first book he wrote, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, has sold over 500,000 copies. Some of his works have been quoted by authors, politicians, leaders, journalists, teachers, students, and even in court cases. Would you please welcome J Federer.
Well, it's great to be here with so many friends. Thank you, Cheryl. Chris Long's a great friend. And Act for Cleveland, Dan, thank you for what you're doing. I wanted to mention I do have a book table at the back, and my commercials first. Everything's $20. If you buy 2 things, you get a 3rd one free. Here's one. It's called Change to Change. It's 6,000 Years of World History. The most common form of government is a king. I'm going to mention that today. Another book, my wife has heard me speak for 30 years. She decided to pick out the best stories. Her definition of the best is when they have a crisis, they pray, and things turn around. She likes the positive endings. Anyway, I am short on time because I have a plane, but I want to go through this. You ever hear the concept called deconstruction? And it's a sales technique where the communists would do this thing where you say negative things about a country's past so that they will emotionally detach from it, and they get into a neutral, and then ultimately you give them a pitch for whatever you want in the future. And so this is the sales technique where if I'm a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is I say negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. And I think we can just pop that off. There you go. Say negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. I say, well, it'll dry out your gums, it'll rot your teeth, and you're repulsed by it. And then you get into this neutral world, gee, what are all the kind of toothpaste out there nowadays? And you're open-minded. And then I can give you my pitch for this new tartar-controlled breath freshener stuff, and you're like, ah. So it's this detach, unattach, reattach phase, and they're doing it culturally. So the first thing they do is they say negative things about the founders of the country. Oh, they're slave owners and chauvinists. You're like, oh, I'm repulsed by them. Then they get the kids into the neutral. What are all kind of beliefs out there nowadays? And then they give them their pitch for their communist, Islamic, LGBT type future. And so we see Europe has gone through this phase. Europe had a Judeo-Christian past, right? Catholic, then Protestant Reformation, Jewish neighborhoods. And then Europe went to the secular French Revolution. And Robespierre put the prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covered her with a sheet, and said, this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. And then Napoleon spreads this French secularism all around Europe, and Europe becomes secular. It embraces this, free sex agenda and so forth. And now Europe is becoming Islamic. And we see not only these refugees coming in, they're having on the average 5 kids per wife, and the Muslim male can have lots of wives. They all sign up for the welfare. The #1 name for newborns in London, Milan, and Brussels is Mohammed. Most of southern Holland is Moroccan Muslim. 10 years ago there were 3 mosques in Germany. Today there's 200, and actually Saudi Arabia just offered to build another 200. And then the #1 crime in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark is rape. Muslim immigrant men raping European women, because Muhammad permitted his men to rape the women infidels that they would capture. And so Europe is going through this transition. And so we see culturally, when you look at history, you can see these trends. If all you know is the present, and I ask you, put a dot on a page, where's the next dot going to be? You really don't know. But if I can show you all the dots preceding that dot, you can put a ruler up next to it and draw it out and say, well, it's probably going to be along this line. And so as we know history, we can get a trajectory to see where things are headed. Here is the Assistant Secretary of State, Ann Richards, and this is the UN Relief Agency, is bringing 70,000 Muslims a year into 190 U.S. cities without citizens having a say. This is how the Roman Empire fell. Remember, until the Great Wall of China was built during the Han Dynasty in 200 AD or so. And this made it so the Mongols could not invade into China, so they turned west and started attacking the tribes across Central Asia. It displaced them, and they began to spill over the Roman borders. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Anglo-Saxons, Jews, Lombards, a lot of our ancestors. And they began to come over slow, learn the Latin language, assimilated, worked lower jobs, and then they began to come over in such large groups that it was a resettlement project. I mean, they would just come over the Rhine and just plant there, and they would keep their own German, French, Anglo type language, and ultimately it broke up the unity of the Roman Empire. And so we see this Resettlement Watch is a website, and it's keeping track of how they're bringing 8,000 Somali Muslims into Cheyenne, Wyoming, 10,000 Syrian Muslims into Boise, Idaho. Literally, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that Hillary met with in 2011, they actually have a map of America, and they're choosing where this is all going. And a lot of it is funded and backed by Saudi Arabia. And this is at For America Cleveland chapter website. I wanted to throw that up there so you guys please visit that. South America is having a growing Muslim population. You know, Argentina, Brazil, but look at this: Trinidad, 12% Muslim; Guyana, 15% Muslim; Suriname, 25% Muslim. Lo and behold, Hugo Chavez had been bringing Muslim terrorists over from Iran to Venezuela, teaching them Spanish and sending them north. So they've infiltrated all the drug gangs. And they're coming across our border. Those children that the president had, oh, there's this children crisis. And so they're all coming across. And you know, GOP rep, ISIS Mexican drug cartels talking to each other. Former Homeland Security, very true. ISIS may have crossed the border. ISIS running training camp at Texas border. And this is Alan West, nightmare on the border. ISIS Mexican cartels teaming up. And these are these children that the president's concerned about. And Texas Sheriff report ISIS terror cells crossing the border, Boston bombings. Found out that a lot of those Hillary emails, it's our government providing guns to ISIS. That's why she doesn't want them to come out. And Fort Hood shooters, beheadings in Oklahoma, and street signs in Arabic in Michigan. They're wanting to bring 50,000 of these Syrian Muslims into Detroit. And California, the terrorists, the wildfires are claiming they're set by terrorists. And so this is a situation where there's a concern. This is Ferguson. I lived a half an hour from Ferguson. I spoke in Ferguson twice. Somebody held up an ISIS sign. So the concern is the president bringing these Muslims over here in such large numbers, and we're being set up for an Arab Spring. Simultaneous Fergusons and Baltimores all across America as an October surprise right before the next election. In the midst of a crisis, there are so many executive orders that if there is a national crisis, the president gets control of the internet, the banking system, the highways, the waterways, the publications, literally everything. And so we have a president that really doesn't like limitations. Right? I don't have time to wait for Congress, got my pen and my phone. And so what is an election but a limitation? And so that is one of the concerns when you see there is an agenda being worked out. They are being brought in such large numbers. The question is why? Anyway, so it's also happening in the military. The military's gone from a Judeo-Christian past. I wrote a book on FDR. People say, why did you write a book on FDR? Well, he was conservative back then, but since then, both the left and the right have moved to the left. Did you know that FDR passed out New Testaments and Book of Psalms to all the soldiers in World War II? He wrote the foreword to it. As Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the armed forces. I have one. It's all dog-eared. Here, just 70 years ago, a Democrat president was passing out New Testaments. A Republican wouldn't even dare suggest that nowadays. Right? And so you go from the military having a Judeo-Christian past. In 1947, the Code for Cadets said that every cadet had to attend a religious service, Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. Right? At Annapolis, they had chapels, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. That was it. But now Europe's going into this LBGT type of present, but now we see that the very people we were warning about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they're in the military doing the proselytizing and making converts amongst our troops. And so here's an Admiral President Obama gave us a choice: accept gays in the military or resign. And so we see that we're now having our military submit to Islam. Now this is one of the things I wanted to bring up today. It's a question, and then I'm going to go through a long way to come up with a short answer. But I hope you'll find it interesting. Who is the king in America? Now you got to think, who is the king in America? Well, let's talk about kings. America is, you're smart, America is unique. What's the most common form of government in world history? Well, there's 6,000 years of recorded human history. Writing was invented around 3,000 or 4,000 BC, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. It started as an accounting method. You know how you tally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And the Sumerian kings had warehouses full of barley and oats, and they had their accountants keep track of it. And then it turned into keeping track of decrees and astrology and genealogies and so forth. But anyway, it was about 3,300 BC. Egyptian hieroglyphics were invented around 3,000 BC. Chinese pictograms around 2,600 BC by the Yellow Emperor. But you round it out, around 3,000 or 4,000 BC is when writing was invented, and we're around 2080. So 4 and 2, that's 6,000 years of recorded human history. Isn't that interesting? Here's James Wilson, signed the Declaration and the Constitution, and was put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. Pretty smart guy. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibited to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they and their posterity should live. He thought something really unique happened here in America. Daniel Webster said, miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. He thought something really unique happened in America. Well, during the 6,000 years, by the way, 6,000 years is only 60 people living 100 years each, back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. It's not that long. But the records we have show that the most common form of government is a king. And these kings want to conquer more and more and more. And so it's this quest to get power to rule, and ultimately a quest to rule the world. And so during the 6,000 years, what do the records show? Empires rise, empires fall. Empires rise, empires fall. But one thing keeps repeating itself. Power gravitates into the hands of one person. And we call this one person by different names. Caesar, Caliph, Chairman, Chieftain, Tsar, Despot, Dey, Kaiser, Khan, King, Mughal, Satrap, Sheikh, Shogun. The name changes, but the function remains the same. One person ends up with life and death power over everyone in their jurisdiction. And so we got Sennacherib and, Sargon and Alexander the Great and Cyrus of Persia, Montezuma, Justinian, Attila the Hun, Chandragupta, Genghis Khan, the Muslim sultans, Kublai Khan. Here's King Louis the 14th, the Sun King. He said, I am the state. Right? He controlled all the area we're living in, right? That part used to be part of the Louisiana land that the French controlled. Now, power wants to concentrate. It's like gravity, it's like a magnet, the gravity pulling that satellite back down to Earth. It's like a pecking order that's put inside of the DNA. And so, remember the movie The Lord of the Rings? I like that. There's a verse in there where everyone wants the ring of power, and Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. Now I think it goes back to the fall in the garden, and selfishness coming into the human DNA, and Cain killing Abel, and one king taking a kingdom from another king. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one of them will take the rattle from the others. And you put some kids on a playground, one of them is the bully hogging the ball. And you put some people in the woods, one of them is the Indian chief, and you put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. And all a king is, in a sense, is a glorified gang leader, right? And it's this hierarchical system, where if you are friends with the king, you're more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you're less equal. If you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. And it just happens. People say, well, if I got to be the king, I'd be really fair. Well, let's say you got to be the king. And everything's going along fine until you have a sister with a teenage son that drinks and drives, hits somebody with the car, and this person dies, and this teenage son's facing the death penalty or life imprisonment, and your sister comes begging to you and says, you're not going to let little Johnny get locked away or killed. It wasn't his fault. Those other kids talked him into it, blah, blah, blah. What are you tempted to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if you're the family or the friend of the king, you get a little special treatment, right? You're more equal. If you're not the family or friend, you get less treatment. And then if you're an enemy, that king's going to be tempted to use his power to shut you up. And so power concentrates into the hands of the king. Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so America's form of government is unique. And it took centuries of struggle before America was given the chance to break away from a king. And so we're going to jump into history, and we're going to see how it touches what's going on today. Muhammad started his faith in 610 AD in Mecca. And he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. And he gets confrontational. And so the people of Mecca decide to chase Muhammad out of town in the year 622 as disturbing the peace. His rich uncle dies, Abu Talib, who was his protector. Everyone was afraid of this rich uncle, so they let Muhammad alone, and so he could try to make converts with his new faith. And then his wife Khadijah dies. And 619 AD is Muhammad's year of sorrows. And so he's finally chased out of Mecca. He goes to a city called Al-Taif. He's a Muslim refugee. And the city of Al-Taif does not want him. And they pelt him with rocks, and they throw dust at him, and the kids jeer him out of town. And so Muhammad has no place to stay. He is a Muslim refugee. And so Muhammad goes to a Jewish city called Medina. The Jews are nice. They let Muhammad come in as a Muslim refugee. And he presents his faith to the Jews. They don't accept his faith, but they let him stay. He goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina, and he begins to get a following. And some of the pagans resist, and they mysteriously get assassinated. The rest of the pagans figure they better join him. And so now he's got a following. He's sort of organized in the community. We're sort of familiar with that term. And he goes back to the Jewish leaders, and he demands political accommodation. And he forces them to make a treaty with him. And so now Muhammad is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then something happens. Muhammad's followers in Mecca, they get pushy, argumentative, confrontational, and threatening. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They're Muslim refugees. And the Jews let them into Medina too. And they gravitate towards Muhammad's neighborhood, and Muhammad allows them to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, his attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. And so the Meccans are having their caravans go through Medina, but Muhammad and his warriors would rob them. And so the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to escort and protect their caravan. And Muhammad, with 300 warriors, defeats 1,000 of them at the Battle of Badr in 624 AD. This amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, convinces Muhammad that his Allah wants him to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He even used a catapult when he attacked the city of Al-Taif. And hurling these rocks into the city, they're smashing and killing innocent women and children. So when they tell Muhammad that he's killing innocent women and children, his response was, they are among them. They got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers say it's okay to kill innocent women and children to advance Islam because Muhammad did. And since he's the perfect Muslim, he is the DNA of Islam. Muslims that want to be better Muslims, they want to be more devout Muslims, they want to be like Muhammad, religiously, politically, and militarily. So there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam is not just a religion because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. So a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. Bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? He was all three, religious, political, and military. And so we see that when Muslims come in, it's in the DNA of the system to come in as a Muslim refugee, then increase and demand political accommodation, and then eliminate the previous culture. And so I spoke in Detroit, and afterwards visiting with people, there was a lady who had a ministry of pregnant moms. And she goes by a Muslim house with a little present for the pregnant mom, and out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom, all pregnant by the same man. He's practicing Sharia law in his house in Dearborn, Michigan. And so another guy comes to my book table, says, oh, Fossil bought a bunch of houses on the street, has a wife in each one. They go down to the welfare office, say my husband's not around, and they get these checks. He visits them, and the more kids they have, the larger the checks get. He's living like a king, and all the kids playing in the middle of the street are his children. He is practicing Sharia law on his block. Then they take over several blocks and they vote in the school board, and now they have the burqas and the prayer time in the schools in Dearborn, Michigan. They take over several more blocks and they vote in the police department, fire department, and now they have their minarets and their calls to prayer on loudspeakers 5 times a day, no different than Pakistan. And so we see it's this transition where they first come in as immigrants, and then they gravitate together, form a community, get an imam who says, okay, follow the Quran a little closer, ladies start wearing the burqas, don't leave the house unescorted by a Muslim relative, and then don't be friends with those infidels. And they begin to become more serious about following their faith. Some call it radicalized, but it's really just becoming more serious about following Muhammad. And then there's always that stickler that says, I'm not going to move out of this neighborhood. I grew up here. That's when Muslim youth do random violence, and there's no witnesses because no Muslim family is going to witness in court against another Muslim family on behalf of some kafir infidel that refused to move out. And so there's no witnesses to the crime. Finally, all the non-Muslims move out, and before you know it, it is completely taken over by Islam. So wherever they build a mosque, mark it on your calendar, within a few years, the demographics around that mosque will become predominantly Muslim. And so those that vote to allow those mosques in, those politicians on the city board, you need to hold them personally accountable for the loss of your property value. They're in office to protect your property value, yet when they build the mosques, that the area, the property values go down and more Muslims win. Anyway, Muhammad concentrates power to a whole new level. Before Alexander the Great conquers, he doesn't make the people give up their religion. He actually mixes some of the Greek gods with the Hindu gods. The Romans don't make the people give up their religion. They conquer a people, they take that country's god and stick it in their pantheon in Rome with all the other conquered gods. When Islam conquered, they were conquering Persia. The Persian emperor said, look, we'll give you all the land west of the Euphrates. We'll keep what's east, and if that does not satisfy your land hunger, nothing will. And the Muslim commander said, we're not fighting for land, we're fighting to force you to convert to Islam. And so it concentrated power ideologically, very similar to communism. Matter of fact, it's a little bit more serious, because communism, they're atheists, and they're not afraid to die. Islam, they believe they get virgins in paradise, they're anxious to die. And so, anyway, so Muhammad comes into this Jewish city of Medina. And there's 3 Jewish tribes in the city. And he had made a treaty with them. But he gets offended at one Jewish tribe, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. He picks on the one the other 2 didn't like. And so the big ones are like sitting back saying, oh, at least he's not noticing us, we'll keep our head low. And so that little tribe is chased out. Then he picks on the smaller of the last 2 tribes, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. This set a precedent in Islam called hudna, H-U-D-N-A, hudna. It means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. Here we are twisting Israel's arm to make a treaty with the Palestinians when their concept of treaty is just to restock missiles. Here we are saying, hey, let's make a treaty with Iran when their concept of a treaty is just to cry uncle for a minute, and then when they let go, you fight back. And so the 3rd Jewish tribe in Medina, Muhammad bottles them in their neighborhood for 25 days. When they finally surrender, he brings them into the market and chops off their heads. 600 or 700 of them, and then he sells the women and children into slavery. He did keep one of the Jewish wives for himself, Rehana. He ended up having 11 to 22 wives, the youngest being 6-year-old Aisha. But within 5 years of Muhammad coming into the Jewish city of Medina as a Muslim refugee, there is not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They've been chased out, killed, or enslaved. And he played upon their political divisions. If he would have come in and said, I'm going to get rid of all the Jews, they would have set aside their differences and teamed up together. But he took advantage of the Republican, Democrat, different party distinctions, and so the different ones would let him come in. And so within 5 years of Muhammad's death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia is wiped out. And so we see this lightning expansion where they conquered Ghassanid, were Arab Christians. Yemen was a Jewish kingdom. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city for 3 centuries since Constantine. Syria was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul, until Caliph Umar conquered it. Egypt was Christian, evangelized by Mark, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, until Amir ibn al-As conquers it. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century, and they're all wiped out by the Umayyad Muslims. This happens as a heart attack to the Roman economy, because Italy was trading with that. So suddenly, it was like China, if they ever held their ships back for 3 months, all of our Walmart shelves would be empty and our economy would grind to a halt. Here's the boot of Italy, Rome, and it was trading with North Africa and the East. All of a sudden, boom, North Africa and the Middle East is gone. And the Roman economy just has a heart attack. And then, one of the things that was held back was the ships filled full of papyrus reeds that grew along the Nile Delta that they dried out and used for paper. So suddenly there was a paper shortage in Europe. They write fewer books, and we call this the Dark Ages. So Islam is largely responsible for Europe entering the Dark Ages. And then they invade Spain in the year 711. They have Arabian horses, scimitar swords, stirrups. Spaniards are still fighting on foot. In 10 years, the Muslims conquer all of Spain, cross the Pyrenees, conquer southern France. Pope Gregory puts out a plea. Anybody that can fight should join Charles Martel. And he stops the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, just shortly away from Paris, in the year 732 AD, 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in 100 years in a military campaign. Then they come around the other side, and they have another spring. So the first of what I just explained was the first Arab Spring. Now the next is a Turkish spring. Turks originated around Mongolia, sort of the same place the Huns did, and these Turks came in 2 waves, Seljuk Turks and Ottoman Turks. And when they invaded into what is today Turkey, it used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Turks, the Muslim Turks. Ephesus, Colossae, Galatia, and, these cities that there are New Testament letters written to, all wiped out by the Muslim Turks. And the Greek Christians were very proud. They viewed themselves as the true Christians. And they viewed the Catholic West as the church split. So it was a big humbling of these, because the Greeks spoke the language of the New Testament. The New Testament was written in Greek. They speak Greek. Their land was where all these cities where the New Testament were. So they viewed themselves as sort of having a little bit of a corner on the market on Christianity. They viewed the Latin Catholic West as the church split. So it was a big humbling for these Greeks to beg the West for help against these invading Muslims. The West sends help. It's called the what? Crusades. 9 major crusades in 200 years. You know who led the 3rd crusade? Richard the Lionheart left his brother King John in charge of England. Remember the Nottingham, Sherwood Forest, and who? Robin Hood stories. That's the 3rd crusade. And I grew up in a city named after the guy that led the 7th and 8th crusades, St. Louis. He was King Louis IX, King of France. Anyway, when the Crusades ended, the Muslims pick up and they invaded into Eastern Europe. So by the year 1300, the Muslims control their ISIS, their Islamic State. They called it a caliphate, because the Caliph is the supreme leader after Muhammad died. And so he controls Spain, North Africa, the Zanzibar coast, down to Madagascar, over to Indonesia, the Mughals of northern India. Tamerlane, a Muslim leader, wipes out 17 million people in Central Asia. And then they go into the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And they invade Serbia, Wallachia, Moldova, Bulgaria, Albania. All these Eastern European countries are fighting off this Muslim horde, this gang, so the rest of Europe can develop art, literature, and music. By the year 1450, the Ottoman Muslims have crossed the Bosphorus, where the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean. That great Greek, Byzantine, Roman Empire, this is what's left of it, just that little bit there. Now what are these green and brown? Those are Venetian and Genoan merchant states that are selling military goods to the Muslims for money, knowing that the Muslims are going to turn around and use it to try to conquer Constantinople. So we have this dynamic of financial interests in the West betraying the West to Islam for money. Sort of like businesses that are doing, Standard Oil Company in 1938 discovered oil into the sands of Saudi Arabia. And in 1 generation, Saudi Arabia went from the poorest Muslim country to the richest Muslim country. And they had this Wahhabi violent version of Islam that they began to finance and spread. And so they are the financial force behind all this fundamental going on stuff in the Middle East. And they're using it with our money. And so we see this so finally Constantinople falls, and when it does, it cuts off the land trade routes to India. Now people forget, 1271, Marco Polo goes from Venice, Italy to China. And he talks about how they had a bow and arrow, right? They had invented thread from worms. They had silkworms. They had plates made out of China. They invented gunpowder. The Chinese invented paper from tree pulp rather than from papyrus reeds. And they used that paper and they made currency. So Kublai Khan had the first current paper currency. Unfortunately, he printed too much of it, and that contributed to the Yuan dynasty collapsing. The Chinese invented the wheelbarrow, the compass, the Pony Express. I mean, they were ahead of Europe technologically, and India had teas, dyes, and spices, and the Europeans wanted to trade. But when the Muslims conquered Constantinople in Central Asia, it cut off the land trade routes. There was actually the thugs. The word thug is these caravans that would go across. These Muslim warriors would, just one of them by themselves would sort of come and just ride along with the caravan. And everybody gets to know them for a couple days, and then another one would come along. And it seemed like a nice ride along a couple days, and another one would come along, and they would be watching their movements, and then when they'd camp, they'd send a signal out, and everybody would come, and they would kill everybody and take the entire caravan. And so that's where the word thug came from. Right? This idea that you get in amongst your enemy and try to act like you're not a threat. But while you're there, you're strategizing, you're figuring out how you can take them over, and then finally, bam, you hit, and you wipe them out. So finally, the Mehmed II conquers Constantinople, and when it does, it cuts off the land trade routes to get from Europe to India and China. And so the Europeans begin to look for a sea route to India and China. And so Columbus set sail in 1492. He thought he had made it to India. So he names the people he meets the Indians. Think of it, we never would have called Native Americans Indians if it had not been for Islamic Jihad. If it had not been for the Islamic State, the ISIS, the Caliphate, conquering Central Asia and cutting off the land routes to India and China, Columbus would have never set sail looking for a sea route, meet some people and think he was an Indian and name them Indians, and the name stuck. When the Muslims were invading Greece and Turkey, the Greeks fled to Florence, Italy. And they fled with their Greek art, architecture, literature, and this flood of Greek stuff into Florence, Italy in the late 1400s we call the Renaissance. But the Greek scholars also fled with their Greek scriptures, and this is when the Western Europeans began to translate their Bible, not just to Latin, but all the way back to Greek. Here's Erasmus, who was a friend of Martin Luther. And so this interest in the original tongue of the New Testament laid the foundation for Martin Luther starting the Reformation. Who knows, we might not have had a Reformation had it not been for the Muslims conquering the Greek Christian civilized area. And so as they're creating this tumult, conquering, the civilization is moving further away from them. Martin Luther starts the Reformation in 1517 and 1529. 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, Austria, under Suleiman the Magnificent. This guy controls a huge area of land. Martin Luther says the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil is not beaten first. There is reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. The fight against the Turk must begin with repentance. We must reform our lives or we shall fight in vain. Our sins have earned God's wrath, so he justly gives us into the hands of the devil and the Turk. John Calvin wrote in 1543, I hear of the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. Who will stand up to oppose his marching throughout the land at his mere will and pleasure? John Wesley later wrote, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, the espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. 2 centuries before the Reformation, Thomas Aquinas wrote, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believed in him were brutal men, desert wanderers. Muhammad forced others to become his followers by the violence of his arms. And so Sultan Suleiman controlled this whole huge area, largely that had previously been Christian. So he controlled North Africa. There used to be, again, those 250 Catholic dioceses going. Egypt conquered, Arabia, Middle East, Persia, Eastern Europe, Turkey, and his counterpart was the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor of Spain, Charles V. And he controlled Spain, Italy, Spanish Netherlands, by marriage Portugal, and the Portuguese areas, and the New World. The Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. So these are the two world superpowers, sort of like the Cold War, US, USSR. Back then the superpowers were the Muslim, Ottoman East, and the Catholic Holy Roman Empire West. And so Charles V is faced with a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation on one hand, Muslim invasion on the other hand. So he decides to strike a deal with the Protestants. And it's called the Treaty of Augsburg, the first treaty ever to recognize Protestants. And this Treaty of Augsburg has this little Latin phrase that made a big difference. It was cuius regio ius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these invading Muslims because they want to kill us all. Now, Charles V probably would have not made that concession had the threat not been so terrible. And so we see this sort of reverse impact that this Islamic immigration, this Islamic spread had on Western Europe. So, the different kings of Europe could believe different things now. And so, Northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland Dutch Reformed, Greece was Greek Orthodox, Russia was Russian Orthodox, England was Anglican, and of course Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Italy, Poland remained Catholic. But the situation was one Christian denomination per country in Europe. Now there were Jewish neighborhoods in all these cities, but they were limited to living within inside of their neighborhood. They were called ghettos. And so it was this attitude. If you did not believe the way your king did, you were persecuted and you fled. And so there was this mass migration of people shifting around Europe in the next century simply for conscience sake, and those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. Is it beginning to make sense to you, right? Sometimes you see a digitized picture on your computer screen and it's like you can't tell what you're looking at, but you click zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, all of a sudden you can recognize it. And so, King Henry VIII in England had been Catholic. He was married to Catherine of Aragon of Spain. And after 18 years, she did not have a son. A daughter married, but not a son. Henry decides to divorce her. The Pope would not recognize the divorce. Why? She's the daughter of the King of Spain, and Spain is like the most powerful empire in the world at the time. And so the Pope says no. And King Henry said, well, you know what? I'm far enough away from Italy. I'll just make myself my own Pope. He starts the Church of England, puts himself on as the head, and he goes on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. But his advisors suggested if he really wanted to break with Rome, he should stop using the Latin Bible, get himself an English Bible. He spreads the English Bible around the country thinking this will solidify my break with Rome. And something unexpected happened. People began to read it and began to compare what's in this Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives and claiming to be the head of the church. And so a group started that wanted to purify the Church of England, and it was nicknamed the Puritans. The king did not think he needed any purifying thank you, so he persecuted this group. There was another group that decided, hey, we're going to separate ourselves, and we call them pilgrims. And they met in secret barns and basements. They were persecuted and they fled. Only they decided to flee across the ocean. And they were going to land in Virginia, which was an Anglican colony. But instead, they got blown off course, landed in Massachusetts. Now, I read through every charter of every colony. Most of them, it's the king deciding who's going to rule in his stead. Well, the pilgrims were going to go to Virginia. And so they had not anticipated landing in Massachusetts, and they didn't want to get off the boat with nobody in charge. And so they decided, well, let's write a Mayflower Compact. And there's this little phrase that made a big difference. In ye presence of God, we mutually covenant ourselves together to form a civil body politic, and agree to render all due submission to the laws we pass. This was them granting themselves permission to start a government and agreeing to obey it. That was revolutionary. And it became a blueprint for the other New England colonies and eventually the U.S. Constitution. So, each colony was founded by a different Christian denomination. Virginia was Anglican. Massachusetts was Puritan. New York was Dutch Reformed. New Hampshire and Connecticut were Congregationalist Christian. Maryland was originally founded by Catholics, and New Jersey by Swedish Lutherans, as was Delaware. Rhode Island was founded by Baptists. North Carolina was Anglican. They wanted to hurry up and populate the colony, so they let others in. And then they got a new governor that wanted to tighten the screws, and a bunch of the Presbyterians and Quakers and Huguenots that came to North Carolina said, we're not going to submit to the... So they split away South Carolina in 1711. Pennsylvania was Quaker, William Penn, and Georgia plain Protestant. And here's Vermont's constitution. It was the first state that came in after the Revolution. And it says, nor can any man who professes the Protestant religion be justly deprived of any civil right. All men have a natural and unalienable right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their conscience. This is Ohio's 1802 Constitution, that all men have a natural and indefeasible right to worship Almighty God, according to the dictates of their conscience. 3 assumptions in the Ohio Constitution. 1, God exists. 2, he's singular, monotheistic. We're not talking Hindus or whatever. 3, it's assumed that you're supposed to worship him. You have a right to worship. They're assuming that you're supposed to worship. You just have the choice as to how you're going to do it. Anyway, now let's look at New England. Right? So most of the colonies, it's the king deciding who's going to run in his stead. New England was this unique experiment where the pastors and their churches started colonies. And so you had a pastor, John Cotton, in his church, founded Salem, Massachusetts. A pastor, John Lothrop, in his church, founded Barnstable, Massachusetts. A pastor, Roger Williams, in his church, founded Providence, Rhode Island. Pastor Thomas Hooker, in his church, founded Hartford, Connecticut. A pastor in his church, John Wheelwright, founded Exeter, New Hampshire. In New England, it was this unique experiment where pastors and their churches founded congregations. Right? So Massachusetts was Puritan. And so you had Thomas Hooker saying, well, I don't like the Puritan stuff. Church of mine, we're going to go. Anybody that wants to, get your wagon and your oxen, and we're just going to start taking off, and we're going to find some place where we'll be friends with the Indians, and we're going to start a community. And so they do. Then they go to the pastor and they say, how do we do the government thing? And the pastor says, well, let's look at the scripture. And so the pastors, so in New England, it was not separation of church and state. It was the church creating the state. It was the pastors and their churches creating communities. And so, Calvin Coolidge writes in 1926, the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, brotherhood of man. In order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. Anyway, the pastors had 2 different views, Calvinist view and then Pietist view. Calvinists believed God had a plan for your life, your marriage, your family, your church, to put it in place. Pietists said, oh, you're not supposed to be involved in worldly things, and so you shouldn't be involved in government. It was their version of separation of church and state. Anyway, there's some pastors, I'm going to skip past for the sake of time. So the New England experiment was, does power go from the creator to the king to the people, or does it go from the creator to the people and they elect their own leaders? Now this is interesting. Where did these pastors get the idea that the people should rule? Well, they got some from England and some from the Roman Republic, some from Catholics, but ultimately Israel. Did you know, here's Harvard President Samuel Langdon writes a speech, the Republic of the Israelites, an example to the American states. And Israel is the first instance in history we have of a nation being ruled without a king. Those first 400 years when they came out of Egypt, they come into the promised land and everyone's equal. There's no king to put it up next to. It's the beginning of the concept of equality. Israel is the first nation with private property. All those boring chapters where they divide up the land. And the land was permanently titled to the families. If they got in a pinch and sold it, every 50 years it reverted back. Wherever there's a king, your land ownership is always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross him, he'll take your land and your life. Now, if you can control land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called it being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. Israel had no police because everyone was taught the law, everyone enforced the law. Israel had no standing army because every man was in the militia and ready to fight. Israel had no prisons because the law said immediate justice at the gate and city of refuge you could run away to. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. So when you harvested your field, you left the gleanings for the poor people to pick through. So it was a way to take care of the poor without the government collecting the money and then giving it away to those that will vote for their re-election. Israel had a system of honesty where the God said he hates unjust weights and measures. And so this would provide a basis for commerce. And Israel got to choose its own leaders. Moses said to the children of Israel, how can I alone bear your cumbrance? Take you, wise men, and understanding, and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. In other words, Moses did not go out among 3 million people and say, you. No, he said, you take the ones known among your tribes. Have a reputation for being fear God, love truth, and hate covetousness. You bring them to me, and I'll anoint them as your leaders. And so this was an election process. So here you got Deborah, a woman. She's a leader in Israel simply because she knows the law and she's honest. And so where else in the world could a woman become a leader just by virtue of her own knowing the law and being honest? And you got some great candidates that I heard here today. And so Israel was the first nation that could read. Sumeria, those cuneiform characters, they had 1,500 of them. Imagine memorizing 1,500 anythings. And only the kings and the scribes could read them. And then Egypt had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters. Only the pharaohs and the scribes could read them. The scribes kept it complicated on purpose as job security. They were needed to interpret the scribes. And so only the upper class could read. It was very similar to Virginia and Maryland prior to the Civil War. They had laws making it a crime to teach slaves to read. Frederick Douglass, the Republican advisor of Lincoln, talks about being a little boy, and the slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet. And the slave master walks in and yells at her and says, "Don't teach them the alphabet, they'll grow discontent and run away." And so when Moses came down the mountain, he didn't have the law in 1,500 cuneiform characters or 3,000 hieroglyphs. He had the law in a 22-character alphabet that was so easy to learn the entire nation became literate. Israel is the first instance in history of an entire nation that could read. And not only could they read, they were required to read, and the law was addressed to each person. Here it is true. The fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. If we don't have a proper fundamental moral background, we finally end up with a totalitarian government that does not believe in rights for anybody but the state. So we see, it's this process. One side is total government, the other side is no government. Total government, you get a dictator, no government, it's anarchy, unless the people have internal morals. But why obey the internal morals? Israel had the key ingredient, a God who's watching everybody, wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something, you know you can get away with it, and then you think, wait a second, God's watching. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate with this stealing thing. And it creates something called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes God's watching, he wants to be fair, he's going to hold you accountable, everybody self-modifies to fit in and empowered to keep these internal morals. You get rid of this God, then all you got is, hey, why follow these morals? Well, some may out of habit, but somebody's going to find a way to get around it and steal and kill and smash windows and set buildings on fire and have a mob riding in the streets. And everybody's going to say, government, please step in to restore order. And the government will come in with their militarized police and their armored personnel carriers, and they'll go house to house, collect everybody's guns. And yes, they'll restore order, but when the dust settles, you'll have just given up your form of government from ruling yourself back to a king. Now, I'm going to skip past some things for the sake of time. So Israel's system worked as long as the priest taught it. When the priest stopped teaching the law, every man did what was right in their own eyes. And they ended up having the Sodomites banging on the house and wanting to all do all their stuff. And so people go to Samuel and said, we want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And the Lord tells Samuel, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So God's perfect plan was for Israel not have a king, everybody be equal, everybody own private property, be blessed, and the priest teaching them how to read and keep the system. Anyway, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead. How's this going to change? Well, you get rid of this God, then you have chaos, and then the people will give up their freedoms to have order restored. So 500 years ago, Italy was a bunch of city-states. Venice, you know, in Naples, Florence, Siena, and they always fought. Machiavelli thought, if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the end justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is so good, any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city, they'd hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, the people would cry out for help. The prince would come in, kill the very criminals and bribe, nobody would know the better for it, and they would all praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher, and they'll pay anything for it. Thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on crises to consolidate control. So remember Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste? That inspired somebody named Hegel. Isn't he handsome? When Napoleon conquered Prussia so easily, the king said, we got to strengthen the state. So Hegel says the state is God walking on earth. He came up with something called dialectics. That's a way to concentrate power. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You start here, you create the antithesis. In other words, you create a problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And that inspired Karl Marx. They said, okay, you send in agitators, community organizers, labor organizers, agent provocateurs, and their goal is to create a really bad crisis. And so everybody surrenders their freedom to a dictator. 45 countries fell to communism this way. And so they would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, the poor against the rich, the blacks against the whites, the Catholics against the Protestants, Muslims against the Christians, Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. They really don't care who the two sides are. They just want to come in and find the people that have a grievance and stir it up until it breaks into violence. And it works best if the people don't have a Judeo-Christian faith. Even Napoleon said religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. So you get rid of religion, all they got is human passion. And you say, you've been wrong, you want what they have, follow me, you'll get it. And so we see this inspired somebody named Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky was in Chicago, rode around with Al Capone's hitman, Frank Nitti, and saw how all you had to do is kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would submit to the mob and pay extortion protection money. So Saul Alinsky applied this to politics. Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky, and our president was a community organizer with the Saul Alinsky people. He said the organizer's first job is to create the issues and the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue and helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. And so what we see is this being played out in America. There's a thought is, are these Muslims being brought over because they're really good at rioting? And they're going to have this crisis that is going to say, we need the president to step in. Our local police departments are inadequate. Please federalize all our police departments so that you'll have a standing army on our soil. And so it's sort of Proverbs 6, where it says, 6 things the Lord hates, a proud look, a lying tongue, and he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. That's the political strategy being played upon us, is the sowing of discord. Now the question I started is, who's the king in America? Now, you got to think. Here is what signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, said: the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Chief Justice John Jay, the people are the sovereign of this country. Signer of the Constitution, James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. They have not parted with it. He goes on, in a free country, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. Thomas Jefferson writes, but the Chief Justice says there must be an ultimate arbiter somewhere. True, there must. The ultimate arbiter is the people. Andrew Jackson, the people are the government, the sovereign power. Pope, the people are the only sovereigns recognized by our Constitution. Gerald Ford, never forget that in America our sovereign is the citizen. The state is a servant of the individual. It must never become an anonymous monstrosity that masters everyone. Omar Bradley, in the United States it is the people who are sovereign. The government is theirs to speak their voice and voice their will. Ronald Reagan, only by positing sovereignty in the people and not the state can we hope to protect freedom. And so when somebody steps on the American flag, what they're saying is they don't want to be king anymore. Right? To the republic for which we stand. The republic is the people rule through their elected representatives. And when you're stepping on it, you say, I don't want to rule anymore. And if you're not going to be the king, somebody else is. Anyway, so Calvin Coolidge, the history of government on this earth has been almost entirely rule of force, held in the hands of a few. Under our Constitution, America committed itself to power in the hands of the people. Teddy Roosevelt, in no other place, in no other time, has the experiment of government of the people, by the people, for the people been tried on so vast a scale as here in our own country. And so imagine you're visiting a king, maybe the Old Testament, you're going through the streets of Jerusalem, and you're witnessing crimes and murders and rapes, and you get into the king's chamber, and he has his head in his hand, and he says, you saw that crime coming in here? I wish somebody would fix it. You like reach over and tap him on the shoulder and say, excuse me, you're the king. This is your kingdom. You are the one accountable to God to fix this mess. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the crime and terrible things going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix this mess. Hello, reach through the TV tube and tap you on the shoulder. You are the king. This is your kingdom. The politicians are your servants. You are accountable to God to fix this mess. Somebody says, I wish somebody would tell me what I'm supposed to do. Could you imagine the king going to his servant and saying, what should I do? A maid, butler, what should I do? Anyway, so if the people are the king, who are the counselors to the king? Well, did you know in 379 AD, the Roman Empire is now Christian. Remember, Constantine converted. And the emperor is Theodosius. He's going to church in Milan, Italy, where the pastor is Bishop Ambrose. Could you imagine being this bishop and having the emperor in your church on Sunday? Guess what? That's what we have in America. 70% of the people in America identify themselves as Christian. They're going to some pastor's church, and they're sitting there, and so the pastors are counselors to the king. And so you ever seen the movie The Lord of the Rings? There's this one scene in there of a King Theoden, and he has this spell cast on him, and his eyes are gray, his hair is gray, he's like totally comatose and out of it. And he has a counselor to the king named Wormtongue. And this guy says, stay asleep, don't get involved, separation of church and state. Yes, you're the king, and yes, your kingdom is being overrun, but don't worry about it, soon it'll all be over. And then somebody else is a counselor to the king named Gandalf. He comes in and casts the devil out of the guy, says, wake up! And right before your eyes, the king's like, whoa, dark have been my dreams of late. Yeah, you've been asleep. And Gandalf says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you hold your sword. And so the pastor's job is to wake up the king. So you have one pastor that says, no, we don't want to get involved. No one throws a bucket of cold water on his congregation and says, you don't just have the right to vote in America, you will be held accountable to God for what happens in America. And so, even Martin Luther King Jr. said the church is the conscience of the state. So I tell pastors, if the most important thing is to bring people to Christ, the second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. If you're really convinced that's the answer, you're going to want to preserve the freedom, because if Sharia law Islam takes over, it's the death penalty. Try that. Go to Saudi Arabia and tell somebody about the gospel. If North Korean communism takes over, you tell somebody the gospel, they'll lock you in a labor camp the rest of your life. And if the gay homosexual agenda has their way, they're going to censor all your sermons, and they're going to tell you what you can and cannot say about the gospel. And if that act that they do is not a sin according to the Bible, then there really are no sins. And if there are no sins, you certainly don't need a Savior. And if there is a God, he is so confused, he's putting men in women's bodies, and you got to do operations to fix it. So if he does exist, he is really messed up. Right? And so they're wanting to twist it. Anyway, so someday you're going to be dead. I just like end the sermon, end the message with that. It's a nice little thought. Someday you're going to be dead. People are dying all around the world for their faith. Someday you're going to be dead, but I believe that you're going to be in heaven because you believe in the grace of God. And you'll all be up there to meet Moses and David and Gideon and Deborah, and they're all going to tell their stories of standing up to Pharaoh and standing up to Goliath and standing up to 100,000 Midianites. And we're just going to be, man, this is so great listening to them. And then they're all going to look at you and say, tell us your story. What did you do? What was going on down on earth when you were there? I hate for any of us to squirm in our seats saying, I sort of just ran away from it all. No, we're going to say, man, let me tell you about this. They were, changing the definition of marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis. And the baby that the Lord himself knew in the mother's womb, Jeremiah, and Jesus was in Mary's womb from the moment of conception. And so this is our chance to do those courageous things that we'll be known for forever. Ronald Reagan said here, for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the founding fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Well, my website's AmericanMinute.com. I send out a daily email, and I'm going to be by my book table for a few minutes before I got to catch a plane. God bless you. Thank you so much.